Unity is really the search for history and the search for definition. And if I might just have a few preliminary words, I'll get on the way. I want to note our personal laws in a voice like John Killens, and then a voice like James Baldwin. I want to notice because a people need spokesmen, and they need people who search out what is needed and what John Killens called long-distance runners, people who can go all the way and go that extra mile. Both John Killens and James Baldwin were unique as writers. John Killens always chose subjects for his novels neglected by others, and mostly Baldwin. Baldwin did something in his novels. It made him a monumental figure in the literature of this nation. He restored the personal essay as a literary form. The personal essay had gone out of style in literature. No one was writing the personal essay well enough for it to hold up as literature. In writing about his personal problems, he wrote about universal problems. And yet, the vantage point from which he wrote was James Baldwin growing up in the Harlem community, trying to resolve the difficulty of being black in a nation that promises so much to his people and delivers so little. He died at home, away from home. And his death in Paris his death in France raises a question. Why so many of our writers, Richard Wright, and so many of our artists, Henry Tanner and others, why so many of them have to leave the United States to find enough peace in order to write. In one of my last conversations with him at Cornell University, he said there's something about the United States that eats into a person's manhood, and he don't feel a whole man in this country. And he have to leave the country to find an intellectual home in order to put his writing down. Sometimes he thinks out things in America, and leaves America in order to write them. Nearly all of his books were written abroad, where he had enough peace of mind in order to write. All right, now, after this lecture, the last lecture, and I will be here for it, will be called The Lonely Nation Away from Home. It will be solely about Black America. And what is so unique about Black America, and what is so misunderstood, because the Black American is really the loneliest of African people outside of Africa, the most misunderstood people outside of Africa, generally misunderstood by other African people, because the nature of the oppression in the United States have made something cruelly unique about the plight of the black American that other African people have not only not understood, but hadn't even sympathized with. And so many times other African people join with whites in condemning or passing judgment where judgment is not in order, where understanding is in order. We inherited, and I've said this before, the worst of the oppressors. I've also said that Europe dumped its human garbage can into the Western world, and this nation got the worst of that garbage can. The other oppressors, first place, they'd been oppressors before, and they developed some style and technique in oppression. This nation still has no style and technique. It's very crude and no manners. And the black American had to face something that others have not had to face. Years ago, when I first went to Haiti, and I felt a liberation, I said, at last I'm in a country where black people rule. I can sit any place I want to on the bus. The fact that it was some of the most uncomfortable buses I've ever sat in my life didn't matter at all. The important thing, I could sit any place I pleased on an uncomfortable bus, and it wasn't uncomfortable to me because I could sit any place I pleased. I could look at a policeman, he was black. The fact that they were some of the most corrupt, head-beating policemen in the world, I didn't know, and I didn't take into consideration they were just as brutal as any other police in the world. But the fact they were black intrigued me. When I came out of the South, every white person was a policeman. Any white person can beat your head. Now, this is not generally true in the Caribbean islands, not generally true in Africa. I'm not saying that there's no oppression there. There is oppression there. It's of a different nature, but it's still oppression. Slavery in the Western world, African slavery, started in the Caribbean. In fact, the slaves were taken to the Caribbean to be broken before they were sent to the United States for well over 100 years, before America began to develop the kind of shipping that would go directly to Africa and pick up slaves other than to buy them from that market. All right, now, indirectly into the subject, I have been preparing all week a short history of Pan-Africanism, which is a history of unity. And I have been examining a lot of interesting phenomena that I have been looking at through the years and talking to the creators of it through the years. Fortunately, of the three great Pan-Africanists who came from Trinidad, I knew two of them personally, and one's still alive. And I talked to him, I argued with him no later than last year, C.L.R. James. I knew Padmore in Ghana when he was advisor to Nkrumah. In examining the trends of Pan-Africanism that actually started in the Caribbean, and yet, though it started in the Caribbean, Pan-Africanism had unified one island in the Caribbean. Although the theory starts there, principally because the greatest theoreticians the Caribbeans have ever produced are generally driven out of the Caribbeans, and they generally function away from home. Now, at the conference on Marcus Garvey in Jamaica a few weeks ago, I delivered a paper on state formation in the 20th century as advocated by Marcus Garvey. I was pointing to his finest gift and why he became popular and other men advocating approximately the same thing did not inject that one ingredient, the control of a state or the state. And he introduced the concept of state formation. And introducing the concept of state formation, he also dealt with how we lost the nation state. This is where I began to talk about tonight's lecture. The nation state and how we lost it. And if we're ever going to have unity again, have a correct perception of our history again, we're not only going to have to know what the nation state is, but how we controlled a nation state without any assistance from other people, and how we were not only lost the nation state, but how we lost the concept that we once had the nation state and were programmed into dependency. And this came principally through the loss of the history of a people. And one of the things Marcus Garvey was trying to restore was that concept of history that made you believe again in your ability to control the nation state. Now, I said in my talk in Jamaica that angered a lot of Jamaicans, except the Rastas, because the Rastas agreed. I said, Marcus Garvey is 47 years dead. We are hailing him as a national hero. If Marcus Garvey were alive today in Jamaica, there are some Jamaicans who would stone him to death. And so some of the intellects said, no. The same day they announced over the radio that they were giving medals to the Jamaicans who participated in the invasion of Grenada. Nothing could be more anti-Marcus Garvey than for one black nation to crush the freedom of another black nation. That single act was so anti-Garvey, it was figuratively stoning Marcus Garvey to death, taking him out of the grave. Because I had said in a previous lecture, and almost had to fight my way out of the hall, I said, with the election of the Bostonian conman, the best thing you can do for Marcus Garvey, the most honorable thing you can do for him, is to go to Kings Park and take his bones out of that grave and throw them into the sea. Because you have dishonored him by saying, of all the brilliant minds produced in Jamaica and in the Caribbean islands, there's not one that I think is worthy of ruling over me. And then, soon after, some of the followers of the Bostonian called and said, we know who you are, and if you ever come to Jamaica again, be prepared to go straight from the airport to a Jamaican jail or to a Jamaican undertaker. So years had passed, and I had not been in Jamaica again. I wasn't prepared to go to a Jamaican undertaker or to a Jamaican jail. I arrived happily surrounded by my beautiful and wonderful Jamaican friends, arguing over who I was going to have dinner with the first night, giving me all of the beautiful island hospitality that I had grown accustomed to years ago, finding all the warmth and the gentleness that I had when I lived in Jamaica. I felt no fear at all that anybody was going to do anything to me at all. Went to the university. The Rasta brothers were there, talking sense and nonsense as usual. And as usual, saying that we Rastas never been. I'm listening as usual with some degree of respect and wonderment. But I wonder how did such a country of wonderful and beautiful people got so mixed up politically when it could be the political jewel of the Caribbean Sea. And I think principally because it lost its concept of history. There is a story told about Suma, and an old man years later comes upon the idea, see, there's nothing left of the great Sumerians. Then he asked another, what happened to them? And the other old man answers, they lost their history and they died. And when a people lose their concept of history, they die politically and culturally. They are in confusion. All right, now let's go back and see what kind of nation state we had before we lost the state. What kind of universities, what kind of scholars. It is hard for you to conceive with all the anti-African propaganda that you were once the masters of a nation state, not only the equal to Europe, but had a university system better than the Europe of that day. Let's go back now to the 1400s, when Europe is coming out of its bind after the Crusades. It was a drain on European talent, drain on European money, drain on their treasures. Although they were rapers and robbers and brought a whole lot of wealth back into Europe, but the cost of the Crusades was so high, the net loss was far in excess of what they had gained. Now, this period is over. Famines, plagues have taken 1/3 of the population of Europe. Europeans had not discovered or developed the regular use of soap and water. You think he is antiseptically clean, always been that way. You should study a book called Dirt, which deals with the history of sanitation, or the lack of it, in Europe. All right, now, when Europe learns how to build ships again, when they go out into the world again to replenish their food supply, their energy supply, they have to take it from other people. The other people, being unsuspecting, are surprised and are defeated. Now they have to create a rationale, a reason for having done so. Because you cannot successfully oppress a historical people. So you've got to take most of the world out of history. So you have to forget what they did for you. You have to try to forget or rationalize what you did to them. And so the great states in inner West Africa, called the Western Sudan, are going. They have to forget Timbuktu. They have to forget the great educational centers, especially Sankore, one of the great universities of the world of that day. Two universities, Sankore, Salamanca in Spain. They have to literally make slaves out of the Africans who had maintained these great universities. Now, what the African people are losing is their concept of history and a place in history. Now, being brought to the New World, being given a Bible that they did not write, not seeing any image of themselves inside of it, they began to have the illusion that they played no role in the involvement of history. Now, it is not until the 1700s that we began to suspect that we have played a role. When we began to suspect we played a role, there is a kind of unity between the Caribbean free man and the African American free man that should exist today, that unfortunately does not exist, because at that period in history, the Caribbean free man didn't call himself a West Indian or Caribbean. The black America didn't call himself an American. Both of them had a unity because both of them called themselves Africans. And both of them saw there was only one interest, and that was the interest of African people. All right, now, because the climate in the West Indies had changed. It had not changed to the point of eliminating slavery, but the craftsmen had gained their freedom and had gained a voice and some mobility. So there began to be a traveling Caribbean person. Many of them came to the United States looking for better opportunities. So now, in the 1700s, a man came from Barbados, Prince Hall. He heard all of the talk about liberty and justice, and he assumed that they were talking about us. He assumed wrongly, of course. And he was told, if you own property, you could get justice. So he bought some property. Didn't get any justice. So if you're a preacher, you get justice. Became a preacher. Nothing changed. Then he told you got to have an organization. So he got himself an organization. Applied to the British to get a Masonic order charter. Couldn't get it. Finally got it from an Irish regiment who was angry with the British. He started the Masonic order. First black Masonic order. Did he call it that? No. He called it the African Lodge. Now this was a responsible organization, not a bunch of liquor-lapping hounds that you see today. no social climbers, no ladies showing off new dresses. These were responsible people. These were free blacks working toward the freedom of the slaves, meeting for serious reasons. Now, they began to underwrite the first writings about our history. In other words, the first writings about our history had to be subsidized. Prince Hall and his group were wise enough to realize that the writer had no money of any consequence, but he could write well, and he knew what he was writing about, so he would give him a little money to sit down and let him finish his book. So many of the escaped slaves sit down in the lodge and finish their narrative about their life in slavery. Then they began to have newspapers much later. Peter Ogden from Antigua had found the Odd Fellows. Now, why am I emphasizing the Caribbean input into the early Afro-American freedom struggle? Because they had a little more freedom at this juncture, freedom of movement, than the black American. And they did not use it as proud, arrogant prowess, came over beating breasts, I got more freedom than you, my slave master is better than you. They didn't use it that nonsense. They said, well, let me go over and see if I can give you a hand. And that's what they did. These were able men. So this continued until the slave narrative became a part of the record of the mistreatment of slaves and a part of early American literature. And the rough-hewed slave narratives existed until a better written slave narrative would emerge under Douglass. All of this is a part of the writing of history. There was a slave who had been a slave in the Caribbean islands and been in England because his master traveled and took him because he was a good valet and he read well, and he was a very intelligent man, Equiano. Now, you're beginning to have a better written slave narrative, written by literate people, putting down the history of our treatment and the history of the background of the same people in Africa. Equiano's diary, worth reading today. Frederick Douglass's Life and Time, worth reading today. Now you have the beginning of a telling of the life of misery until in the 1800s, early 1800s, blacks began to demand an even greater voice. Douglass is out there now, the finest voice we produced in that century. The great black ministry is out there. Now, a Jamaican mulatto, John B. Russwam, and a black American, Samuel Cornish, starts a newspaper, Freedom's Journal. Now, Freedom's Journal becomes the first newspaper, and the editorials in that newspaper are better than some of the editorials in newspapers today. Sounder, clearer, more biting. After Russ Wam had served for a number of years on the newspaper, he went to Liberia with the settlement movement, set up a newspaper called the Liberia Herald. Still exists. All the papers still existed. All the papers continue to exist. New papers came on the scene, the Anglo-American newspaper and magazine. New personalities came on the scene. The first black American novelist appeared, William Wells Brown. He wrote history in his novels, then later wrote general speculative history using the Bible and such history books as he could understand, speculating on the history of Ethiopia. His famous novel, Clotel, the President's Daughter, deals with the numerous offsprings of Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson's taste for chocolate is too well documented for me to have to get into tonight. He just loved those black women. Good taste too, I guess. One, Sally Hamas, had 7 children by her. Yet all the time he was speaking about democracy and morality and also saying he didn't believe in social equality. All kind of contradictions. Lincoln said he didn't believe in it either. All right, he signed emancipation for another reason, but we don't have time to get into that. He wanted to weaken the South in the Civil War. So now, as we approach the 1850s, another recorder was on the scene. He came to America briefly, couldn't get into schools, and he left. His name was Edmund Wilmot Blyden. Went to Liberia College, went to Togo and discovered the circumstances of his own family's enslavement. Would later write a book, in spite of its age, over 100 years old now, and it's still worth reading, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. Wrote an early book on Palestine, one of the early blacks to deal with the Jewish situation. His travels in Egypt, still worth reading. But a little book that is almost as up to date today as it was when he wrote it, on African customs, pointing out the values in African society that we need to use. Edmund Wilmot Blyden. There are several books about him. These are books by him. Now, as we approach the 1850s, on the eve of the Civil War, we have a few people structuring our history. We have a few poets, Jupiter Hammond, and an unknown poet on Long Island who would write the first poem of satire. I've repeated it before. My old master promised me when he died he'd set me free. Lived so long his head got bald, got out of notion of dying at all. This is the first poem when blacks cast some doubt about the promises that was being made to him. He was a slave on Long Island. They did have slavery in Long Island, while in some parts of New England it was too cold to keep them the year round and they could work their way out. certain other places they kept them the year round because they found something for them to do the year round. A brilliant black woman poet appeared in these closing years of the first half of the 19th century, Elaine Wilkins Harper, an anti-slavery speaker, an anti-slavery poet. She wrote poetry depicting the horrors of slavery. In one of her main poems she would read on the platform is, "Bury me not in a land of slaves." She wrote a novel dealing with the consciousness of whites in relationship to being a Christian and a slaveholder at the same time. She is forgotten now, and her life begs for a good writer to put it all together and do a good biography of her. Elaine Wilkins Harper, one of the forgotten greats. I have not dealt with Phyllis Whitley. I've not dealt with Phyllis Whitley because I have a little prejudice here, and I don't want to get into it tonight. I think she was too mild with her poem to George Washington and to Lord Willingham. Just turned me off to the point where but what turned me off was the poem when she said that she thanks God for taking her from her pagan land and teaching her Christian heart to understand. Teaching her pagan heart to understand. She don't know she came out of an area that had just as much Christianity or more than she came into. Well, that's enough about poor Phyllis Whitley at the time. Now, on the eve of the Civil War, we had growing newspapers, we had men recording, we had the Colonization Society, well recorded, we had well recorded travels, we had a brilliant black novelist and protagonist, Martin Delany. We had a Jamaican, Robert Campbell, who joined him to go out to Nigeria to search for a place. They both wrote books about their respective travels. And if you want the books in the University of Michigan paperbacks, Ann Arbor paperbacks, there's a book called Search for a Place. Martin Delany's report, Martin was a Harvard man, so it's a Harvard man's report. I mean, all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. Robert Campbell, a man with limited education, wrote one of the most moving reports ever. Pilgrimage to my motherland. Spiritual feeling, visiting Africa again, being an ex-slave, now a free man, free with limitations of course, visiting the continent of his birth. Robert Campbell was Jamaican. I'm talking about a period of intellectual collaboration when Caribbean people didn't think of themselves as West Indians or Caribbean people, when black Americans didn't think of themselves as Americans, thought of themselves as African people. I'm talking about a period before someone invented a word called Negro and color. Even someone used the word color, it wasn't widely used. But 1829, another great document, a second-hand store owner, pawn shop owner, David Walker began to write his famous appeal. And because people pawned their clothes and left them there during the summer, he would put some of the appeals in the coat pocket. And sometimes the sailors way out to sea before he noticed them. This is how the appeal got to England and got published in England. This was David Walker's appeal to the colored people of the world. He was the forerunner of a Malcolm X. He was God's angry man. Now, David Walker recorded the anger and the passion against slavery of the African person of that day. And he might have been the best recorder of that period before the period was over. But the one record that we need to examine, uniquely and creatively phony though it is. Now let me explain what I'm saying. Nat Turner's confession is no confession. Nat Turner was so brilliant. Nat Turner confessed only to those things nobody could do anything about. He named only the people in his group who were already dead or escaped. He did not admit he had a wife, and his wife was a secret keeper of the conspiracy. I mean, that was unique. And the white man who took down the confession and who hated his guts kept pestering him. Don't you know you have killed people? People have died. Don't you know you are going to die? And he was waiting to be hung. That time said, yes, I know that. Listen, don't you understand what you have done? You have revolted against the government. And that time said, the consequence, as a consequence of revolting against slavery, I knew from the beginning that I might have to die. So aren't you sad about it? Aren't you weeping? But I don't see a tear in your eyes, and you've done this horrible thing. He wanted him to crawl, and he said, I'm so sorry, I had to kill him. You feel your wife. He ain't crawling, he ain't crying. So this man is still pursuing him. They take him to the gallows, put the rope around his neck, and this man, you know, aren't you sorry yet? Don't you know you're going to die? Nat Turner looks at him, though he's looking at a piece of dirt, and tilts his head while they tighten the rope on him. He said, didn't God die? Die like a man. And all this man got from Nat Turner is a phony confession. It's not worth anything, because Nat Turner's confession didn't hurt nobody. Because all the people who lived through it and got away, he didn't give their names. It was really not until 10 years later that Thomas Wentworth Higginson discovered his wife, who was the secret keeper for the insurrection, and began to make a record of it. Now, the importance of this for today is that in an age of media, where revolution, where TV is literally killing the minds of a whole lot of our children, including mine, we don't tell them those beautiful stories, because those stories not on television, not going to be there either until we own a television station and put it there. And if you know what some of these stations, networks sell for, do you know we can dig up that kind of money? Do you know we spent last year $500,000 on potato chips? You know, any housewife with a stove can make potato chips? An idiot can make potato chips? You don't have to be wise. If we start doing the simple things for ourselves that other people are doing for us, we could make money catering to each other. There's no law against sending 10 trucks down to Florida, picking up some oranges and bringing them back and selling them to ourselves wholesale. And nothing wrong with it. We got truck drivers. We got the money for the trucks. We're not doing it. All right, now, back to this history. Because I'm only going halfway and I've got a lot to do. After the Civil War, after a period called Reconstruction, the beginning of the land grant colleges, the beginning of higher education, we began to put down in our own way the history of our churches, the history of our societies, most of these things privately written, and some well written, some not so well written, some endorsed by a group of men or literary women who underwrote the expense of having it done. But we were coming back into history. Finally, after some rough starts and some pretty good basic layman's history, a non-profession, but a politician, would write a formal history of African people in the United States, and he would call it A History of the Negro Race in the United States. His name was George Washington Williams from Ohio. This is the first formal history. There have been other histories, informal, written by people who were not historians and had no history training. He had good history reading and a good discipline about himself. He would argue as to whether to use the word Negro. Then he would lose the argument with himself and go ahead and use it. And I'm sorry he lost the argument. But he himself proved there was no such thing. But he thought if he used something else, people would know what he was talking about. So he used it. Now we have a formal history appearing in the 1880s. Now, with the period underway, a lot of tracts, a lot of material written by late ministers. Bishop Turner is on the scene. Henry Highland Garnett, whose motto was resistance, resistance, has written a lot of his, not only his speeches, but has written his famous appeal, modeled after David Walker's appeal. Martin Delany had written a novel, a protest called Blake. We're getting it together from a point of view of literature. But now, in the 1880s, a young man from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, who had been educated there and assumed he was going to Harvard because the young men who made high marks went to Harvard. went to Harvard. They sent the white kids to Harvard and sent him to Fisk. He began to feel color prejudice for the first time in his life. He became conscious of it for the first time. It was there all along. He finally finished Fisk and went to Harvard, did exceptionally well. And there he wrote the first formal scholarly treatment of the slave trade, still a masterwork worth reading. The Suppression of the Slave Trade to the United States by W.E.B. Du Bois, the first book in the Harvard series, books by the former students of Harvard. Now we're beginning to have our history recorded by competent people. He would continue, and his essays would be published. 1903, his famous book, Souls of Black Folks, followed by his book, Gift of Black Folks. Booker T. Washington has recorded his experience under the title Up from Slavery. Now we have a lot of history at a time a new kind of history writer comes on the scene, the radical black journalist, T. Thomas Fortune, William Monroe Trotter, journalist teachers like Kelly Miller, then teaching at Howard University, and others. The foundation for the recording of our history is underway. 1915, the year Booker T. Washington dies, W.E.B. Du Bois would publish a little book called The Negro. This is the first international survey of African people throughout the world, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. He would later expand this into two other books, one, Black Folks Then and Now, and the next one, Africa and the World. Now you're beginning to have African history by Africans. You're beginning to have Afro-American history. You're beginning to have Caribbean history by Caribbean writers. Now, the migration from the Caribbeans, and a lot of people need to note this, would start early in the 20th century, except for individual migrations. There was no mass migration of consequence until early in the 20th century. This migration would change the cultural structure of the community. It would also change the intellectual structure of the community. From the Caribbeans would come Arthur Schomburg. Arthur Schomburg would contribute to a book called The New Negro, a famous essay, The Negro Digs Up His Past. More important, long range, a Jamaican who had formerly been a soldier in the old West Indian Regiment, J.A. Rogers, lived in America so long and visited Jamaica so seldom, most Jamaicans don't know he was a Jamaican. J.A. Rogers was a Jamaican. I heard from his last wife today. A lot of people don't even know he had a last wife, or a first one either. Be that as it may, I keep in touch with some people. J. Rogers began to write polemics disputing the concept of white supremacy. He began because he was light complected and from Jamaica, still the most color stratified of all the islands, color and culture stratified, still. Because he was light complected, he had the hypothesis that the lighter complected person had more brains because we were closer to whites. And so while doing research to prove his point, he disproved his point. And so he began to write about all of the great blacks in history. In his first book, Nature as Nature Leads, 1919, then another book, a debate, still worth reading, From Superman to Man. In his books, Lives of Eminent Africans, this is the forerunner to the book, World's Great Men of Color. Then he wrote a pamphlet on As Nature Leads, was the preface to the 3-volume work, Sex and Race. He was interested in race mixing through the years. As Nature Leads also was the forerunner of a more refined book, Nature Knows No Color Line. But Rogers was a prolific writer and a columnist. But more than any other of the Caribbean writers, Rogers spent 50 years of research looking at the role of the African personality in human history. And he laid the foundation for that inquiry into history to let us know that we too have played a major role in history. 1915, Carter Woodson established the National Association for the Advancement of the National Negro History Group. Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. That was his words. The Negro History Bulletin and the Journal of Negro History. Now you had a formal organization devoted to searching out in a scholarly way, to the extent that he could find scholars, the history of our people in good work. In the Caribbean, there's several Caribbean historical societies. There's one centered principally in Jamaica. Then there's one that embraces the whole of the Caribbean, including the Spanish-speaking and the Dutch-speaking and the French-speaking. In the West Indian Historical Society is centered principally in Jamaica. My main point is that all of us realized that we had played a role in history, and no one was going to write that history except ourselves. All right. Around 1960, 1962, African people, Africanists, people specializing in African history, began to challenge the white interpreters of Africa. They began to discover that most of the white experts on Africa were digging up information to give to the government on how to control Africa. Finally, the challenge came at Montreal. an organization that had been threatening to come into being for a long time. And it just so happens I was head of the dissident organization at the time. But at Montreal, the blacks challenged the whites and formed a new organization, the African Heritage Studies Association. I remember that a famous French Africanist, Raymond Monet, unfortunately dead now, or fortunately, Raymond Monet always began his lectures on Africa by saying, until the 16th century, the African did not know the wheel. And what is all the chariots Africans produced? There was African gladiators in the Roman arena, in chariots with wheels. And he keeps saying that until the 16th century, the African didn't know the wheel. Well, the main thing at Montreal, some young Turks went into a lecture being given by Raymond Monet and broke it up. He said, this lecture is off, this conference is off. And he kept saying, young men, do you understand who I am? I am Raymond Monet. And they said, you are irrelevant, get the hell out of here. They didn't know who he was, or nor did they care. Misconceptions were over who built Egypt in ancient times. And the Europeans insisted that they built Egypt, though they did not exist when Egypt existed. And we kept asking, and we're still asking, how would you build all those great temples in Egypt that was built 2,000 years before you built a shoe for a European, a house with a window? Why would you leave barbarous Europe and build something that fine thousands of miles away from Europe before you build anything of this consequence in Europe? And why is there nothing in Europe of this consequence now? They ran out of excuses claiming Egypt. Now they say civilization started in Sumer, they started everywhere except Egypt. Then they discovered that there were Africans were over there in Sumer too, building. This was the period when there was no separation between Africa and Western Asia called the Middle East. And there's a book called When Egypt Ruled the East. And what you think of as the Middle East was a former colony of Egypt, a colony of the nations of Western, Northeast Africa. And what we're trying to say is that we have looked into our history, and some of the people who have made a life's mission out of it are growing old. Some of them are dying and they're not being replaced. We should have people who make a priesthood out of historical preservation, just like priests go into church and pledge to God and to a given order. People should go into history. Their whole life is the preservation of the history of a people. You don't have to distort it because our history is so good and glorious. You don't have to tell a single lie. You just tell the truth. It's good enough. I have always wanted to straighten out the black heroes and heroines so that I would have enough security and the people would have enough security to let me write about a few black reprobates. Principally because we have had some villains too. We've had some of the greatest people in the history of the world, but we've also had some villains. I would really like to write a decent book about Thibaut Tibb, the black slave trader, he never said he was a slave trader, he said he was a contract laborer. But his contract laborers never came back. So. Or Deborah Pasha, who was also in the same business. Or the Congo Arabs, mostly black, born from the cohabitation of the Arab and the African woman. There's some closed doors in our history, but there were some glorious doors. When I saw that stupid thing, Chaka, I'd like to write a children's book about Chaka's mother. If you write a book about Chaka's mother, you get a good picture of Chaka. You get a good book of African culture. On the mother in African history, the female in African history, you know a lot about African culture. Because you might be insecure in the presence of strong women in this country, but you were never insecure in the presence of strong women in Africa. In Africa, you never debated whether a woman is superior or inferior, because that's almost like saying your mother is inferior to you. And what fool would do that? Can you be pregnant? What are you talking about? She got you here. And you're going to debate about whether she's good enough to walk beside you? The Africans had too much logic to do anything as stupid as this. So what we need to do, in addition to recording our history, we need to study what has already been recorded. We need to really study the judicial system of African people. I mean, customary systems, their system. I remember, and I think I've told you this before, but it's worth retelling. When I was in Ghana, I witnessed a trial because I was staying at the home of the superintendent of prisons in Kumasi. And there was a trial, and it seemed like such a minor thing, and I kept wondering why it lasted 3 nights. 3 men had a job. One man faked an illness, and the other 2 men finished his work and collected the money and gave him his share, gave his proper share. But on the way they saw him in a drinking bar, setting up the ladies and dancing up a breeze. So this made them angry. So they took it to their chief. And the chief was actually trying to satisfy the thing. There was nothing involved now. What was involved was, the total sum was $9. So if the man was willing to give the money back, all right, he did wrong. So no, they wouldn't take it. So it went on, and finally it was called character witnesses after another. Then his wife came in, he's his last character witness, and she said he was a good man, he took care of the children well, took care of her well, but sometimes he's too generous, and he likes to think he's a dreamer. He likes to think of himself as a rich man with enough money to set up people and, buy drinks for everybody. And he hadn't learned how to control himself in that regard. And she would appeal to the men not only to forgive him, they said, well, we have forgiven him. Well, now what is at issue? The men have forgiven him. The trial still goes on. Then she appealed to them to work with him again. Because if they don't work with him again, he is in dishonor. They not only must forgive him, but they must agree to work with him again, so that the dishonor is off, until they not only they trust him again, they'll work with him again, he'll be a friend again. So he's fully restored then. I went back to Kumasi and I asked Dr. Donkwa, Nkrumah's schoolmaster, who was now on the odds with Nkrumah, but that's another story. Dr. Donkwa, what was that trial about? He says, John, his arrogant way. This is affection for him. He's acting like a stupid American. And the child would know what the trial is about. My wife is preparing dinner. Go down in my library and read certain books. You'll find out what the trial was about. Go down in the library, I'm reading an hour. Finally found a little pamphlet by Dr. Donkwa. 26 pages. Obligation in a canned society. I come upstairs. I said, Dr. Donkwa, the trial is about what governs African society. Honor and obligation. Well, John, you seem to see the light. We'll have dinner now. And when you study a society, you have to study more than its history. You must study the moral rules that govern it. This is why in African societies, when the European came, there was no word for jail. These are societies held together by honor and obligation. And when we get that concept back again, move among each other again, and we understand that nobody would snatch a woman's purse. It's a dishonorable thing to do, and you have an obligation to protect her, not to snatch her purse. Once this is understood, once this is ingrained, once we understand that we came out of a society governed by honor and obligation, we can become a people again. Now, all of this talk about unity is also about history. Because if you don't know the history of what you was, you're confused about what you are and what you still have to be and where you still have to go. And I think we have to pay more and more attention to history from our point of view. Get out of the trap of assuming that our oppressor has written any history about us. He hasn't even written a true history about himself. If he did, he wouldn't dare read it if he did. The repeopling of a people, the giving back a people their spirit, the unification of a people is giving them back values that make them appreciate themselves and respect themselves and walk the earth as kings without reducing anyone else to anything else, commanding respect and giving respect. This is what we have to do, because this is tomorrow's work, and this is the essence of the remaking of a people. We are not Western people. We have to stop acting as though we are Western people. We know we live here, and we know we have to make certain adjustments. We know we live in a capitalist system and have to make certain adjustments. But we came out of a sharing society. We have to rescue the spirit of the society we came out of. And we are responsible not only to give the world a new humanity, but we will start that giving with ourselves and with our children. And we will walk this earth shining like a new penny, because we are tomorrow's people. And if we can't be tomorrow's people, the world is not going to be worth living in. Thank you.